Professor David Haskell is. Well, I'm simply gonna let him speak for himself. So bear with me. I'm just gonna do a little bit of housekeeping, and then I will launch David's presentation. I might need someone to tell me if I've got the audio correct or not. So one of my team, maybe you can text me. Uh, Share sound. Oh, wrong direction. And here we go.
About ideas rooted in the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. These days, I spend a lot of time as an activist. I'm an activist for common sense, but I'm also a professor and a researcher at a Canadian university. You may have heard universities are a bit of a hotbed for this diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff. It's no exaggeration to say that DEI ideology has been forced into almost every facet of post-secondary education. So I've got a lot of practical hands-on experience in this area. But today I'm going to move away from my own lived experience and I'll talk more from a theoretical perspective. And that makes me happy. As someone who's been researching and publishing on cultural trends for nearly 2 decades, I feel pretty comfortable discussing the scholarship behind ideas. And it's with the attitude of a social scientist that I want to answer a question. And that question is this: what does the empirical evidence reveal about DEI instruction? Even before I get to the research, though, here's a bit of background on our topic. I'm assuming many of you know, but let's just go through it. The ideas of far left social justice have been repackaged into an educational curriculum. And that educational curriculum is called diversity, equity, and inclusion training, or DEI instruction. Now, this DEI instruction is ubiquitously conducted. It's typically a mandatory exercise in most corporations and educational systems and government agencies. In terms of content, DEI instruction has really two big modules. One is anti-racism education. And anti-racism education is a specific focus of DEI instruction, and it tends to get the most attention. Within anti-racism education, there are specific concepts that are heavily promoted. And one that you might be familiar with is the concept of white privilege. When learning about white privilege, students, if it's an educational setting, are told the successes experienced by a Caucasian person are primarily aided by their skin color and not their personal efforts. Okay, those are the broad strokes on the anti-racism material, but as I say, there's two major modules. DEI is more than anti-racism. So it's got the material promoting the celebration of the LGBT community, and that's covered in near equal measure. Increasingly today, the DEI instruction in that area, especially when it's taught to school kids, focuses on the fluidity of gender. For example, you may have seen the case in the national news where a grade 1 teacher in the Ottawa Carleton School Board Well, as part of her larger DEI curriculum, she taught her students that boys and girls aren't real. People are not born boys and girls, she said. Instead, you get to choose if you're a boy or a girl. So, whether the focus is on race or LGBT, there's a dominant theme that runs through DEI training. And I'm grateful to Musa Al-Garbi, who's the research chair or a research chair and a professor of sociology at Columbia University. He was the one who really drew or summarized this dominant theme. Al-Garbi has studied DEI more than most, and so he summarizes the dominant theme, the main theme of DEI instruction like this. Diversity-related training programs often depict people from historically marginalized and disenfranchised groups as important and worthwhile, celebrating their heritage and culture, while criticizing the dominant culture as fundamentally depraved, for example, racist, sexist, sadistic, etc. Members from the dominant group walk away from the training believing that themselves, their culture, their perspectives and interests are not valued. So what he's saying is that DEI instruction promotes Manichaean thinking in the extreme. Blacks and other racial minorities are good, but whites are irrevocably evil. Those in the LGBT community should be celebrated, and freer notions of sexuality should be celebrated. But straight people and traditional ideas about men, women, marriage, and family, those should be condemned. And this kind of instruction is happening everywhere, especially in our public schools. But supporters of DEI, they justify the pervasiveness of this type of instruction with the argument that Canada and the West generally is systemically racist against people of color and dangerously homophobic and transphobic. So in light of this pervasive bigotry, their logic is this: the medicine must be applied everywhere because the disease is everywhere. But we've got to put that logic to a quick test. Is there evidence that LGBT folks are facing pervasive hostility in Canada? I mean, every court case in the last 10 years that's pitted the rights of the LGBT community against the rights of those who have more conservative values has decided that the LGBT community and their rights overrule the rights of others. In every city, every town of Canada, every government agency, and every institution of public education, a month or more is dedicated to celebrating LGBT pride. And you can add to that tens of millions of dollars that are spent on special government and educational programs only available to LGBT. I don't know. I think many of us would like that kind of hostility. And just by way of contrast, let me give an anecdotal observation. At the public school in my neighborhood, any activity or event, even with a tentative link to Christian culture or Western history, from Christmas concerts to Halloween parties, well, those have been banned. The ban is mandated by the local public school board in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion. There may be systemic discrimination, but it's not the kind that's been advertised to the public. But I want to be a little bit more serious here and talk one more time about systemic racism and how it comes out in the DEI programming. When it comes to DEI's specific claims about systemic racism, we're told that discrimination against people of color is most often hidden. They say it isn't explicit, instead it's implicitly embedded in the institutions of society, and that leads to disparities in outcomes. They hold up any negative difference in outcomes between the country's majority and minority populations as obvious proof of systemic racism. Of course, anyone with a rudimentary understanding of statistics will tell you it's actually not obvious. It's not obvious that differences in outcomes between racial groups are evidence of racism. Correlation does not equal causation. In fact, the most rigorous quantitative studies over the last decade have shown that there is no proof of systemic racism. We can look at the work of American scholars like Thomas Sowell at Stanford or Wilfred Riley at Kentucky State University, or even more locally, related to Canada. There's a recent study conducted by economist Matthew Lau. It was done for the think tank, the Aristotle Foundation. And all these studies and more debunk the notion of systemic racism. Elsewhere, I've gone into this in more detail, and I'm not going to do that right now. My focus, as I've said today, is on DEI instruction more generally, not just the systemic racism side of things. So for our purposes today, I'll simply let the studies that I mentioned serve as a broader example. And here's what that broader example shows. Whether it's a claim about racism or LGBT bigotry or implicit bias of white people or claims about white privilege, in virtually every case, there's a disconnect between the claims being made by the promoters of DEI and what the empirical evidence reveals. Right. So at this point, to help you follow the rest of my presentation, I'm going to do this. First, I'm going to state the main claim made by the proponents of DEI instruction. And then I'm going to reveal what the research has to say about that claim. And then for the last part of my presentation, I'm going to tell you what the proponents of DEI instruction never say. And they definitely don't want you to know. With that plan in mind, let's go to the most prominent repeated claim of DEI supporters. Proponents of DEI will tell you that DEI works. Specifically, they'll tell you DEI instruction makes people less bigoted and more accepting of others. Put more academically, they'll claim that their programs actually change behavior. If you go to the websites or public documents of any DEI office or a DEI consultant, what you'll read is a promise. They promise that because of their instruction, workplace harmony, productivity, and collaboration across groups will increase. And on the other hand, discrimination will be reduced, bias and bigotry will be lessened. But that is a false promise. The research simply does not support claims of DEI instruction leading to positive behavioral change. For example, and we're getting into the research now, in their 2018 peer-reviewed article, Why Doesn't Diversity Training Work?, Harvard sociologist Frank Dobbin and colleague Alexandra Kalev observed this. Nearly all Fortune 500 companies do training, and 2/3 of colleges and universities have training for faculty. Most also put freshmen through some sort of diversity session as part of orientation. Yet hundreds of studies dating back to the 1930s suggest that anti-bias training does not reduce bias, alter behavior, or change the workplace. Now, there are numerous literature reviews and meta-analyses that support Dobbin and Kalev's observation. I'm going to focus on some of the meta-analyses because they provide the gold standard for research conclusions. And you'll recall that a meta-analysis is an advanced research method that combines the data of multiple studies, in this case, hundreds of studies, in fact, to identify overall trends. Now, the trends that the meta-analyses have uncovered in this area are this. The ability of DEI training to elevate harmony and decrease prejudice in any lasting way is undetectable or completely negligible. Here's our first famous meta-analysis. In a review of all available DEI research published between 2003 and 2008, Elizabeth Palek, then at Harvard, but now she's at Princeton, and a colleague, Donald Green, who was at Yale and still is, generated a sample of almost 1,000 studies. After aggregate statistical assessment, here's what they concluded about DEI instruction. Quote, the causal effects of many widespread prejudice reduction interventions, such as workplace diversity training and media campaigns, remain unknown. Due to weaknesses in the internal and external validity of existing research, the literature does not reveal whether, when, and why interventions reduce prejudice in the world. In this comment, we can see that Palek and her colleagues were bending over backwards not to offend the researchers who produce these pro-DEI studies. But she can't avoid giving them a smackdown. She's saying, okay, the DEI proponents are making some very strong claims, but in reality, those claims are just not supported. In her words, the research that has been produced does not reveal whether interventions reduce prejudice in the world. Now, this wasn't the only meta-analysis of DEI claims conducted by Professor Palek. About a decade later, in 2021, she wanted to update her research. So she and a team ran a second meta-analysis, this time with a fresh batch of over 400 studies. In that study, Palek and her colleagues again concluded there is no credible evidence that DEI instruction works to decrease prejudice. And they further determined that research supporting DEI tended to be very shoddy. They stated, although these pro-DEI studies report optimistic conclusions, we identify troubling indication of publication bias that may exaggerate effects. They then clarify what they meant by exaggerate effects. Palek and her team found that when measured accurately, the effect size of diversity type training is near zero. Now, some of you might not be familiar with the term effect size. Think of it like this. Effect size measures the difference between those who participated in the DEI training and those who did not. So, the difference in attitudes and actions of those who took DEI training versus those who did not take the training was about zero. There was no difference. Okay, I've got one last meta-analysis to discuss. I said that Palek did hers in 2021, but there's one that came a year later in 2022. Two different researchers doing that study. They were Patricia Devine from the University of Wisconsin and Tori Ash at Syracuse University. Now, they released their own meta-analysis on the DEI research, but it's going to sound familiar. Here's what they discovered. Our primary conclusion following our review of the recent literature echoes that of scholars who conducted reviews of the diversity training literature in the past. Despite multidisciplinary endorsement of the practice of diversity training, we are far from being able to derive clear and decisive conclusions about what fosters inclusivity and promotes diversity within organizations. Implementation of diversity training has clearly outpaced the available evidence that such programs are effective in achieving their goals. Did you hear that? The implementation of diversity training is huge, but it has clearly outpaced the available evidence that such programs are effective. Let's pause for just a minute and summarize what we know so far. We know that thousands of studies promoting positive DEI claims have now been subjected repeatedly to various meta-analyses. And we know that the collective conclusion drawn from those thousands of papers is that there is no evidence that DEI does anything good. There's no evidence that it reduces prejudice. There's no evidence that it increases harmony. And now we could stop there. With that information, right now, we would be able to go into any DEI office, in any school or any workplace, and we could say with confidence, the claims you're making are not supported. There's no evidence that you do anything good. We might even throw in for good measure, why are we paying you? But that would be only half the story, because DEI instruction does do something. There's very clear evidence that DEI instruction does harm. And it's to those studies that I'll turn now for the last part of my talk. While the good of DEI training remains elusive, the harm associated with it is less equivocal. It's pretty clear. DEI instruction has been shown to increase prejudice and activate bigotry among those who participate. Why? Well, it brings existing stereotypes to the top of their mind. Here's some proof. Reviewing the related findings from past research, Harvard's Frank Dobbin, who I mentioned earlier, says this. Field and laboratory studies find that asking people to suppress stereotypes tend to reinforce them, making them more cognitively accessible to people. Now, others conducting original research in this same area found the same thing. For example, in a laboratory setting, a University of Toronto research team, which was led by Lisa Legault, she's now at Clarkson University, they determined that race-focused DEI campaigns that exert strong pressure on people to be non-prejudiced actually backfire. Rather than reduce, they elevate levels of bigotry. And others have found that same effect. Here's a last study. It was Neil McRae at the University of Aberdeen. Along with colleagues, they conducted some more experiments. they measured the outcomes of DEI type training. Their published study was titled Stereotypes on the Rebound. Like Legault and her team, McRae and his group asked participants to reject prejudicial stereotypes, just like they do in DEI training. Well, they confirmed that in trying to suppress bigotry, DEI type training activated it. So here's the quote. Indeed, this work suggests that when people attempt to suppress unwanted thoughts, these thoughts are likely to subsequently reappear with even greater insistence than if they had never been suppressed. It's a rebound effect. So it's clear from various studies that when DEI workshop leaders instruct participants to suppress their biases come to mind and they cling to them more tightly. But it actually gets worse. Besides activating and reinforcing existing prejudice, the research clearly shows that DEI training creates new prejudice. Specifically, it increases hostility toward members of the majority population, Caucasians. You'll recall from the start of my presentation the findings of Columbia University sociologist Musa El-Garbi. I told you that he found diversity-related training programs criticize the majority population, calling them flawed. Well, a few studies have measured the negative impact of that radical kind of teaching. For example, researcher Erin Cooley at New York's Colgate University and her team, they found that teaching students about white privilege, which again is a core component of the DEI curriculum, does not do good. It does not make students feel more compassionate toward poor people of color, but it can make them more hostile toward white people. She found strong evidence that teaching the concept of white privilege reduces sympathy and increases blame for white people struggling with poverty. There was a similar study done in 2022. It was out of University of Michigan, and it analyzed online discussions. It found that mention of white privilege destroyed group unity. It found that bringing up the concept made even previously supportive whites less supportive of racially progressive policies. It also made the group less engaged in discussions. And finally, it led to less constructive responses from whites and non-whites. So I've mentioned a bit about DEI's impact on the majority population, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that DEI instruction has no negative impact on members of minority communities, because it does. In its ability to be toxic, DEI is very equitable. To illustrate how DEI harms minorities, I could reference the university admissions scandal that took place in the US just last year. In that scandal, it was shown that students of Asian heritage who applied to elite universities like Harvard were required to have higher admission scores than any other applicant to get in. These top-performing Asian Americans were denied their status as visible minorities. The administrator said, no, you're not marginalized. Their academic performance, because it was so high, got them classified as white adjacent, and thus they became eligible for discrimination in the name of diversity. Of course, to illustrate how DEI harms minorities, I can also reference today's raging anti-Semitism. There's a direct line from the ideas promoted in DEI workshops to the growing hatred of the Jewish people. But I'm going to do something a little bit different. To illustrate how DEI harms minorities, I'll use a less obvious example. There's growing evidence that DEI instruction is linked to worse mental health of minorities. It works like this. DEI instruction, especially repeated instruction, causes racial or sexual minority participants to radically increase their perception of experiencing discrimination. That perception has a serious negative impact. Researchers at the University of North Carolina did a meta-analysis of studies examining the impact of perceived discrimination on health. They found that, quote, increased levels of perceived discrimination are associated with more negative mental health and physical health. Maybe this finding gives us a hint as to why the most devout supporters of DEI, and in this case I'm talking about hardcore progressives, also have the highest rates of mental illness. Now, in this way, I'm venturing into speculation. But it's not speculation when I tell you this. It is for sure that nobody escapes the harm from DEI. So I feel I've made a convincing case. However, I'm sure that if there's someone who is a DEI supporter watching what I've said or listening to what I said, they'll reject all the empirical evidence I've given because they have a habit of dismissing empirical evidence as colonialism or white supremacy. It's inaccurate, but that's what they do. Those are the terms they use. So with that in mind, let me finish with an appeal to their gold standard for believability: lived experience. A paper published in the Journal of Personal Psychology found that 2/3 of human resource specialists, the very experts in charge of overseeing DEI initiatives, say that it is their lived experience that diversity training does not have positive effects. So if you don't believe me, you might listen to those experts. Thanks, everybody.